All right, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack what is easily one of the most stunning political upsets of the 2026 midterm cycle. We're looking at the Michigan Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate. Now, whether you follow the daily ins and outs of Washington politics, or you just want to get a read on the shifting currents of American voter sentiment, this primary is an absolutely fascinating case study. It was a classic clash, pitting progressive new blood against the party's established old guard. And honestly, the results sent shockwaves all the way to the White House. The whole thing really comes down to this number: 14,000 votes. Think about that for a second. In a massive statewide race in Michigan, a state with over 10 million people, the entire primary was decided by roughly 1 percentage point. The winner, public health advocate Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, managed to edge out four-term Congresswoman Haley Stevens. It was a victory that was as razor-thin as it was momentous. And to really grasp why this tiny margin is making national headlines, we have to look at the sheer scale of what El-Sayed was actually up against. Because you have to contrast that razor-thin margin with this: $70 million. That is the staggering amount of outside campaign money spent against Abdul El-Sayed during the single primary race. If you do the math on that, it's roughly $5,000 spent for every single vote in that 14,000 vote margin. No way around it. That's wild. In an era where we often just assume campaign spending is the ultimate predictor of who wins, this grassroots campaign weathered a $70 million storm of opposition ads and somehow still managed to come out on top. So how exactly did that happen? To figure that out, here is the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll start with 1, the Michigan upset, then examine 2, progressives versus the establishment. After that, we'll spend a little time, 3, following the campaign money, contextualize all this with 4, a broader national trend, and finally, wrap things up by 5, looking ahead to November. Let's get right to it. Section 1, the Michigan upset, a midnight stunner. Picture the scene in Detroit on election night. It's well past midnight, the results are totally hanging in the balance, and a very tense Abdul El-Sayed gets up to address his supporters. He said, "I wish I could tell you that I was declaring victory right about now. It turns out it takes a long time to count some votes in Michigan. It actually wasn't until long after the sun had come up that Wednesday morning that the race was finally called. But when it was, El-Sayed had officially pulled off an upset that completely stunned the U.S. political system." Section 2, progressives versus the establishment, a clash of wings. You see, this primary wasn't just a contest between two individuals. It was a direct head-to-head collision between two completely distinct ideological wings of the Democratic Party. On one side, you've got Abdul El-Sayed running on a staunchly progressive platform. We're talking Medicare for all, a focus on affordability, and a pro-Gaza stance that really resonated in a state with a massive Arab American and Muslim population. Plus, he had the backing of major progressive heavyweights like Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, on the flip side, you have Representative Haley Stevens. She's the establishment candidate, a 4-term congresswoman backed by the state's Democratic power brokers. Think Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and several prominent pro-Israel groups. So the contrast in their political identities literally could not have been starker. And throughout the campaign, the rhetoric from the establishment really highlighted a deep skepticism toward this progressive insurgency. During a debate in July, Haley Stevens point-blank stated Abdul is running for celebrity. The establishment's strategy was clearly to portray El-Sayed as an unserious candidate who just lacked the pragmatic legislative experience needed for the Senate. They were really leaning into Stevens' own record of supporting Michigan's manufacturing sector. But of course, the progressive wing viewed this challenge entirely differently. El-Sayed's eventual win was hugely celebrated by his high-profile backers. Just look at this reaction from Senator Bernie Sanders on a recent podcast, calling it the most extraordinary victory. Sanders asked, "Have you ever heard of a candidate in a major race getting outspent 9-1, taking on the entire establishment and winning?" For the progressive movement, this victory was absolute proof that bold, disruptive agendas can actually overcome traditional party structures and all those baked-in establishment advantages. Section 3, following the campaign money, the financial battleground. We really can't fully understand this upset without unpacking exactly where that massive financial opposition came from. Remember that $70 million spent against El-Sayed? Well, an astounding $32 million of it came from one specific organization, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. See, El-Sayed repeatedly slammed Stevens for her vote supporting U.S. aid to Israel, which made the conflict in the Middle East a central, highly polarized issue in this specific Michigan primary. And AIPAC's immense financial involvement was very clearly defined. In a letter sent to supporters following the primary, AIPAC President Bernie Kamenetsky actually labeled El-Sayed as a fiercely anti-Israel candidate. The group made it their explicit mission to try and defeat his campaign. They viewed his foreign policy stance, and particularly his criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza, as a radical agenda that they just needed to actively oppose. But here is where we have to look at the objective context of the electorate. You might be wondering, why didn't $32 million in targeted ads work? Well, this data from a recent Marquette Law School poll provides a pretty major clue. It shows that 55% of American adults now hold an unfavorable view of Israel. That is up significantly from 43% back in March of 2025. What this polling tells us is that national sentiments are shifting. For a lot of voters in Michigan, drawing a line at sending military aid abroad while advocating to fund domestic health care instead was a message that deeply resonated, and it effectively neutralized the impact of all that heavy opposition spending. El-Sayed himself was highly aware of this dynamic. In his victory remarks, he noted that his campaign took $70 million on the chin and kept fighting back. He concluded that what we showed is that the power of our money is greater than the power of their money. For his supporters, it was just a profound validation that grassroots mobilization could ultimately outweigh institutional wealth. Section 4. A broader national trend. Mixed results nationwide. Now, while Michigan was obviously a massive win for progressives, zooming out reveals a pretty complex landscape across the 2026 midterms. Yes, Abdul El-Sayed narrowly defeated the establishment candidate in Michigan by about 1%, but the story was very different over in Missouri. There, prominent progressive Congresswoman Cori Bush faced a rematch against establishment candidate Wesley Bell. Bell, who was heavily supported by pro-Israel groups and mainstream Democratic leaders, defeated Bush by a massive 22 percentage points. So, impartially speaking, while progressive anti-war platforms found a winning coalition in Michigan, that exact same approach did not successfully sway voters in Missouri, who chose to stick with the more moderate incumbent. The national picture remains very much a mixed bag. However, it is absolutely undeniable that the progressive left flank is making structural gains. Beyond El-Sayed, Michigan saw progressive state legislator Donovan McKinney defeat a pro-Israel incumbent for the U.S. House. Left-wing climate organizer William Lawrence won his congressional primary by a solid 15 points. And looking coast to coast, we're seeing progressive challengers ousting incumbents and claiming open seats in safe Democratic districts in California, Colorado, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. The establishment is essentially being forced to recognize that the traditional electoral calculus is rapidly changing. Section 5. Looking ahead to November, the general election pivot. In politics, there is literally no time to rest. The moment the primary results were certified, the focus jarringly shifted straight to the fall showdown. And despite what was an incredibly intense, bitter, and highly funded primary battle, the Democratic establishment immediately closed ranks. Just look at this statement from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Democrats are united by a common purpose, putting a check on Donald Trump. We look forward to working with Abdul and Democrats across Michigan to win this seat in November. El-Sayed similarly buried the hatchet, publicly praising Stephen's love for democracy. It was a remarkably swift unification of what had been a very fractured party just hours before. And honestly, they unified quickly because the opposition wasted absolutely zero time going on the attack. Talk about immediate political whiplash. Former President Donald Trump took to social media right away to label El-Sayed a communist loser who hates Jews in Israel. Trump even claimed the progressives' victory was great news for the Republican Party, immediately trying to define El-Sayed's progressive platform as extreme and radical to the broader general electorate. And the official Republican nominee for the Senate seat, former Congressman Mike Rogers, fully echoed this aggressive strategy. Setting the stage for the fall, Rogers released campaign messaging stating that El-Sayed would make our communities less safe and our state less affordable. With AIPAC also signaling that they plan to stay involved in Michigan to try and defeat El-Sayed in the general election, the stage is set for a highly polarized, incredibly expensive battle this November. Which leaves us with the ultimate question as we wrap up today's explainer: will this progressive momentum actually secure a Democratic victory in November? El-Sayed proved that a grassroots, progressive platform can overcome $70 million of establishment opposition in a primary. But can that same coalition of voters carry him through a high-stakes general election in a critical swing state? Well, I'll be watching closely. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the forces at play.